Hi, this is Anthony. Welcome back to my show. I've always been fascinated by D.B. Cooper, and by coincidence, I live in a suburb of Portland, not too far from the general area where he was believed to have parachuted from the plane, and also where $5,800 from the hijacking ransom was found in the sand along the Columbia River 8 years later. If you're watching this video, I'm sure you know the basics of the case. That the day before Thanksgiving, 1971, a man on Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 demanded and was given a ransom of $200,000 in $20 bills, and after allowing the passengers off the plane, had the pilot and crew take off again, headed south from Seattle. At some point, he was able to lower the aft stairs in the back of the plane and jump from them. To this day, it is officially unsolved, and again slightly under $6,000 was found in the sand on the north shore of the Columbia River, northwest of the city of Vancouver, Washington. One of the preeminent D.B. Cooper researchers these days is Eric Ulis. Originally, he had a candidate that was his favorite to be Cooper. That person's name was Sheridan Peterson. Now, Cooper, the hijacker, smoked 8 cigarettes and left behind the butts, although they seem to have been lost or intentionally destroyed by the FBI at some later point. However, Peterson evidently did not smoke, and it's also believed by the FBI that Peterson was in Nepal at the time, so he is no longer considered to be a suspect. Now, Eric has a new suspect who coincidentally has a very similar last name to his original suspect. The new suspect's name is Vince Peterson. Eric now believes that Peterson is the right candidate because a number of years ago, the clip-on tie that the hijacker wore and left behind on the plane was analyzed, and a number of particles associated with the high-tech and aerospace industries were found in the fabric of the tie, including 3 particles of titanium. Depending on what article you read, sometimes that titanium is described as being pure, and other times it's described as an alloy. That particular alloy, if the particles really are what Eric believes them to be, are ones that he traced back to a particular lab and claims that they were only about 8 people that work there, and that's how he narrowed down the suspect to Vince Peterson. And in one of Eric's videos, which I will have a link to, he claims that at the time he believes that Peterson was given a pink slip or laid off from his job, and that's what prompted him to commit the skyjacking. And also he claims that this was a one-off, that Peterson was not a career criminal. And by the way, Peterson's son doesn't believe that his father was the skyjacker and has stated that for all he knows, his father was pretty honest. Peterson was at least 50 years old at the time. Therefore, I would imagine that his son would have been old enough at the time to be aware of things and would probably be aware if his father was missing from Thanksgiving dinner in 1971. So what to make of this? For a long time, researchers and the FBI have believed that the hijacker had some degree of parachuting or skydiving experience, likely somebody who is a veteran, either World War II or more likely Vietnam. That they probably were somebody that had been involved in a number of shady deals or criminal exploits. All those things make sense, and many of the proposed candidates have had military paratrooping backgrounds, and many of them have had some type of criminal connections. Now, I respect Mr. Ulis, even though I may disagree with some of his conclusions. I do encourage you to watch his videos, and if you do and you disagree with them, please still be courteous in any comments that you leave with him. I think sometimes people could find holes in the theories of other people, or we have our own candidates that we believe are the skyjacker, and therefore we dismiss other people's rival candidates. But let's all be courteous in our interactions with each other. The goal of this research is to find who the person really was, regardless of who we might think it is based on how we look at the evidence. So what are my thoughts about this case? And I'll kind of go through it in the same way that Mr. Ulis went through his video. First of all, I don't think that this was a very well thought out caper. From all reports, the skyjacker was wearing business attire, a dress shirt, suit jacket, dress pants, and presumably some type of dress shoes, either slip-on shoes or shoes with shoelaces. He was also wearing a dark raincoat. I've heard from other sources, and I've done my own research, and evidently, according to weather reports from Portland International Airport, it was in fact windy and lightly raining that evening. It's believed that the skyjacker jumped out of the plane at approximately 8:13 p.m., which at that time of the year is well after sunset. Besides the money, which was not delivered in the bag that was requested, the skyjacker also requested 4 parachutes. Inadvertently, 2 dummy parachutes were included along with the 2 working models. My understanding of the working parachutes that he was given were that they were the type that you cannot control when landing. When you see a skydiver jumping out of the plane and then them being able to maneuver the parachute so that they land right on a particular spot, that's the type of parachute that can be maneuvered. My understanding from other sources is that these parachutes were more like the type that paratroopers jump out of planes with and then they just land wherever they land. Did the skyjacker have some parachuting experience? One would imagine that they would have some familiarity. If you've never jumped out of an airplane with a parachute, you're probably not going to plan a skyjacking where that's your means of escape. However, I've seen it pointed out in many sources that any experienced parachutist should have noticed that the reserve chute that Cooper chose was in fact not operational. So that calls into question just what level of parachuting experience the individual had. Let's look at motive. When investigators look at suspects in crimes, they look at motive and opportunity. Cooper told the stewardess that he had a grudge, but not a grudge against her airline. It's often pointed out by researchers that their favorite candidates may have been experiencing financial problems at the time. Perhaps they were temporarily laid off from the railroad company or from their metallurgical job. Certainly, there could have been jobs experiencing economic problems at that time in the early 1970s. But let me ask you this. If you were one of the suspects that's been suggested, but not one who has a criminal history, and you lost your job or you thought you might lose your job, are you going to turn to crime? In particular, are you going to turn to crime that involves going 4 time zones to the west, carrying on an attaché case that either has real or fake dynamite that's hooked up to a bomb, and demanding a ransom of $200,000, in which your escape method is jumping out of the back of an airliner wearing a business suit in cold, rainy, pitch-black darkness over an area that's primarily rugged forested terrain, and which is bordered on the south by a large, wide river, and assuming that you were able to land without your dress shoes being sucked off as you fly through the cold, wet, icy air, that you would then be able to find your way walking back in the dark to civilization and then getting back to wherever you were intending to use as a return point back to Pennsylvania? It would seem to me that if you were an employee of a railroad or a white-collar employee of a high-tech firm, and that you were going to resort to violent crime to make fast cash, that it makes far more sense trying to rob a liquor store or burglarize a jewelry store than do what Cooper did. So in the video, Eric Ulis proposes that the hijacker survived, buried the money in the sand at what is called Tina Bar, and then perhaps walked into Vancouver, Washington, and took a Greyhound bus up to Seattle and flew back to Pennsylvania. Now, I'm not quite sure why the skyjacker would walk all the way to downtown Vancouver, Washington, just to take a Greyhound bus up to the airport in Seattle, when the Portland International Airport is across the Columbia River from Vancouver. You can see the airport from Vancouver. I just looked it up on Google Maps. The distance from Tina Bar to the airport says that it can be walked in 6.5 hours and is less than 20 miles away. But did the hijacker actually make it to Tina Bar and bury the money? Well, for one thing, everybody believes that the skyjacker jumped out of the plane to the east of Vancouver, and Tina Bar is to the northwest of Vancouver, where the Columbia River has gone from a westerly direction to a northerly direction. And let's think about this. If you've just jumped out of a plane with $200,000 and $20 bills, survived the jump, are you going to bury your money in the sand near the shoreline of the river? And by shoreline, I mean literally where the edge of the water flows. That doesn't make any sense at all. That's literally the last place that you would want to bury stacks of currency. You know, you always see pictures of pirates burying treasure chests in the sand along the shoreline. Actually, there's only one documented case where pirates ever buried treasure, and that was Captain Kidd, who buried his treasure, and it was dug up the next day and handed over to Governor Belmont in New York. There is absolutely no reason for pirates, including air pirates, to bury their money and they're not going to bury it in the sand where it's going to get wet and decompose and get lost as sands shift and rivers change their course. If you had to bury it somewhere there, you'd go up 10 feet into the brush and bury it in the dirt, not in the sand right on the edge of the bar where the water is flowing. Mr. Ulis then contends at a later point, Mr. Peterson returned to the area and dug up all but about 3 stacks of the currency, and then returned to Pennsylvania with it. But evidently Mr. Peterson's employer had continued or had been reactivated with REM crew. So he decided just to sit on the money and not spend it at that time. But of course, we have to remember that the FBI released the serial numbers of the ransom currency, and those numbers were published in newspapers on a number of occasions. And if any individual was the skyjacker and had survived, they would have known that banks and others were on the lookout for the serial numbers from the ransom. And of course, none of the ransom money ever showed up in circulation. However, 8 years after the skyjacking, a young boy playing in the sand along the area called Tina Bar found 2 full stacks and 1 nearly full stack of the ransom money in an extremely decayed state of preservation. So do I think that Vince Peterson is a convincing candidate? No, obviously not. Do the titanium particles on the tie him to the possibility that it might have been him or somebody that worked with him? It's one clue, but I argue in my other videos that the titanium tie, that there could be many other people that come into contact with those particular rare particles of titanium alloy, assuming this is in fact what they are. And also, there were organic spores on the tie which are thought to have come from a pharmaceutical company. There is no evidence that Mr. Peterson would have had any connection to the pharmaceutical industry. Again, I've pointed out in a previous video that Cooper could well have been some type of inspector whose job would take them to both industrial aerospace manufacturing facilities as well as pharmaceutical companies, and that would account for the wide range of materials found on the tie. I think probably what will eventually break the case is if there is DNA evidence that can be obtained, and then using online DNA genealogy resources, the true perpetrator will be unmasked. And I would love for it to be somebody who got away, even if they didn't get away with the money. That makes the story all the more interesting, but I think that there is an extremely high likelihood that the skyjacker, because he is on a plane that is flying south, he's looking north from the back of the plane, standing on the aft stairs. He probably waited until he could see the lights of the Vancouver-Portland metropolitan area, and most likely I think he probably ended up in the water, and his chute may not have even opened up. And it would go to follow that if he ended up in the water of the Columbia River, so did the money, perhaps sinking and then being dredged up and later deposited on Tina Bar, which is where they dumped sand that was dredged from the Columbia to keep it deep enough for ships to travel. It's a logical conclusion, but not the romantic one that we would like to see. Again, I have the utmost respect for Mr. Ulis. Even though I disagree with many of his conclusions here, I still encourage you to watch his videos and respectfully leave comments if you were so moved. I would really appreciate it if you left comments of your own in the comment section here. If you disagree with me, I welcome that dialogue. I'd also love it if you looked at my other videos and clicked the like button and the subscribe button on those. This video has gotten much longer than I had intended, so thank you for sticking with it to the end. I sincerely appreciate it.